Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Money and Metals Network Coin Talk. My name is Campbell, and today I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Eleanor Ghey. Eleanor is the curator of Hoards in the Department of Money and Metals at the British Museum, where she has been a key member of the team since 2007. Her academic journey began with a degree in archaeology, followed by training and professional experience as a museum conservator. She later pursued a doctorate focused on Gallo-Roman temple sites, and her postdoctoral research has explored topics such as roundhouses in Wales and the Iron Age and Roman coin hoards in Britain, a project funded by the AHRC in collaboration with Leicester University. With a deep expertise in the Iron Age to Roman transition, Dr. Ghey plays a crucial role in recording coin hoards reported under the Treasure Act. Now, as usual with these, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat. I will go through them together with Eleanor at the end of the talk. If for whatever reason, and I know people have had troubles in the past, that you cannot type in the chat, please feel free to email me at mmn. I can type that in the chat. It'll be mmn@warwick.ac.uk. I'll keep an eye on that as well. And if I get any questions there, I will go through them with Eleanor as well. So without further ado, I'll pass you over. Eleanor.
Hi, so thank you very much for the introduction, Campbell, and for welcoming me here to talk to everybody today. My name's Eleanor Ghey, and I'm a curator at the Department of Money and Metals at the British Museum. So my role here is mainly reporting on Iron Age and Roman coin hoards, the treasure process. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and what that entails today. My work studying coin hoards submitted for treasure and what that means in legal terms and in practical terms. I'm also then going to give a bit of an overview of what we know about the pattern of hoarding in the British Isles, and then perhaps finish with some discussion about curatorial considerations when working with hoards in the museum context. But I'm going to keep this quite general. This talk isn't really aimed at a specialist numismatic audience, so if you are one of those specialist numismatists, you might want to leave now. But hopefully there's something for everybody. So, what is a hoard? I think we're all familiar with the dictionary definition of a hoard, an accumulation or collection of anything valuable hidden away or laid by for preservation or future use, a stock, store, e.g. of money, or a treasure. But as people dealing with archaeological finds and museum collections, we have a second layer to add to this, and that's the layer of deposition or burial. I use the word deposition more generally for anything that's entered the archaeological record. So we might think about a hoard as coming from a sealed context, archaeological context, by which I might mean a pit sealed under a floor or in a post hole, or perhaps a decayed purse that's entered a pit, or a midden, an ancient place where refuse is put. It could also be a scatter of coins in a disturbed context, for example, a hoard that's been buried in a closed archaeological context or then ploughed out of its original location or disturbed by animals or erosion. So there's a distinction then between coins distributed through the plough soil as a result of general scattered loss of a site where people have been visiting over a long period of time. And this is sometimes referred to as site finds when we talk about this in numismatics. So in some periods where society is highly monetized and using a lot of low value coinage, this might be expected. At other times, this might be less likely. Numismatists attempt to look at the chronological profile of the coins and other aspects in a hoard to distinguish between these general background accumulations of coins and a buried hoard. We might also distinguish between grave goods and hoards, although a grave good, as I will explain later, might be treasure. But these are things placed in the grave. They're not really part of the same economic processes necessarily. And a more common scenario in museum work is a collection of coins found by one person over a period of time. So they might be brought into the museum. Somebody might say, I've got a hoard. They might be said to be from somewhere, but this does not have context, archaeological context or provenance. So it's difficult to call this a hoard. And these are the sort of things we might see quite often by metal detectors, things brought in that might be a lifetime's work. And similarly, there might be other assemblages of coins in museums that we can't really trace back to a hoard, that we might suspect to a hoard numismatically, but we can't prove this. So beyond this sort of idea of what archaeologists think of as a hoard, there is a specific legal framework that I'm working in. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the legislative framework of the Treasure Act 1996 in England and Wales. This defines what we consider treasure here. I'm sorry if this is a little dry, but I think it's quite important to have an understanding of this if we're working in museum context. So this isn't necessarily the same as our definition of hoards as archaeologists. For example, treasure will include a deposit of coins in a spring or in a temple site since the revision of the Act, and will usually not include fewer than 10 base metal coins, although we have every right to call these a hoard. They won't be treasure. If fewer than 10 base metal coins are placed in a purse, for example, and then lost, that is a hoard, but not treasure. So I'm going to run through the history of this briefly, because I think it's important to understand that the changing legal framework over time has created biases in the British data set for hoards. It has encouraged some categories of material to be reported and therefore studied in depth, and others not. So this is the current situation, which we have 2 or more precious metal coins. So this could be a hoard of 2 silver denarii or 10 or more base metal coins. And their associated artifacts and containers. So if a hoard is found in a pot, that will also be treasure, as well as a brooch with it, for example. They have to be over 300 years old, and they have to be of the same find. And that's the most sort of important and tricky part, really showing that all these coins have a relationship with them, with each other originally, i.e. that they were put in the same place at the same time. So people have been finding hoards for hundreds of years. In fact, we have records going back right back to the medieval period of people finding hoards, since before records began. But the current popularity of metal detecting, which is legal in Britain, has shaped recent legislation. So the history of this approach to treasure actually dates back before the advent of metal detectors to the 11th century with the medieval law of treasure trove, which related to precious metal items that were lost and for which no owner could be traced, which traditionally reverted to the ownership of the Crown. But in more recent times, certainly since the middle of the 20th century, the British Museum has acted on the Crown's behalf, and an inquest would be held in a court of law by Her Majesty's coroner with a jury present. And this still happens today, but less frequently with a jury. It's often more of a sort of administrative process. So it was really only in the middle of the 20th century this became more formalised, and finders would sometimes be rewarded. At this time, the emphasis was on finding the owner of the treasure, and it had to be proven that the items were buried with the intention of recovery. So this meant that important burial assemblages, such as Sutton Hoo, were not treasure. And it also meant that temple assemblages were not treasure because the items were thought to be placed in a temple deliberately and not intending to be recovered. Also, under the law of treasure trove, a large hoard of base metal coins would not normally be considered treasure. So, or the big radiate hoards and numbers hoards that we deal with a lot currently wouldn't have been included. And that has had an impact on recording in the past and our understanding of what hoards come from an area. These things might not have been reported if they weren't treasure in the past. But all this changed in 1996 with the law of treasure trove, which was replaced by the Treasure Act, which came into force in 1997 and is the main definition of treasure used today, the one I showed earlier. There have been a few amendments since then. This is mainly technical, though. The change was partly brought about by the large-scale looting of the temple site at Wanborough, which was night-hawked, and thousands of coins were lost, but they were not protected by law because they were seen as offerings made with no intention of recovery. They were dedicated to the gods and left at the site. This would now be included under the law of treasure, under the Treasure Act. More recent amendments have included things like prehistoric base metal hoards and most recently items not covered by the earlier law but seen as of exceptional significance, which would sometimes include single coins. I won't go into that in much detail. So this is what we're working with today. The definition of treasure includes accumulations, as I've said, and things that were covered by the old law as well. So this does include some modern things that are are not 300 years old, but were deliberately concealed and whose owners cannot be traced. A nice recent example is the hoard of coins shown here that were found inside a piano. The British Museum then has had involvement in the treasure process for many years. And since the 20th century, hoards have been studied in the Department of Coins and Medals, now recently renamed the Department of Money and Medals. And these days, the main change is that the process is administered by a government department working with a team at the British Museum, with the Secretary of State acting on the Crown's behalf. So along with the National Museum of Wales, the British Museum runs the Portable Antiquities Scheme, who have a network of finds liaison officers based in museums and local government offices throughout England and Wales. This scheme is a voluntary scheme for recording finds made by members of the public. And they can be, as well as metal detecting, they can be finds made by people gardening or just walking the dog, or by farmers. But in practice, the majority of new finds of treasure are also reported to a finds liaison officer. And the British Museum plays a statutory role in this process in preparing a report for the coroner, advising on whether the find meets the requirements of potential treasure, and also identifying and recording the contents of a hoard. And this is my job. And this is done partly for academic interest, but also to facilitate the valuation process by the Treasure Valuation Committee. These days, we prefer hoards to be acquired by local museums rather than the British Museum stepping in and acquiring things as a matter of course. They have more value as archaeological finds and tell stories about the region in which they're discovered. And the BM is more of a reference collection. So we do have several large hoards, such as the Canetio hoard and the Hoxton hoard, and that helps people studying the type series of coins. And so we may acquire single coins that provide new examples of those types, but this is a research collection used by numismatists. But it's less common these days that we will acquire a large coin hoard. So if a local museum wishes to acquire a find, the coroner will hold an inquest, and the find will be valued independently by a valuer who's commissioned by the Treasure Evaluation Committee. So this is an independent body made up of people who represent the finders, landowners, museums, people who represent the commercial numismatic market, and that together they will agree a price in consultation with the find and the landowner. And when price is agreed, the museum will usually be able to fundraise to acquire the hoard, and the reward is usually split between the finder and the landowner. If a hoard can't be acquired, it'll be disclaimed and then go back to the legal owners. So my job in this process is to provide a catalogue of the hoard, which will be used as the basis for an independent valuer who's commissioned by the Treasure Valuation Committee to work out what's in the hoard and set the value if it's being acquired. But obviously we try and catalogue hoards that aren't going to be acquired as well, so that information isn't lost. Finds liaison officers of the Portable Antiquities Scheme have a role in trying to educate metal detector users and other finders in good practice, and an increasing number of finders leave their discoveries in situ and call for professional help from conservators and archaeologists to record and lift the discoveries as a block. You can see here some excavations. There's the excavation of the Froome hoard, which was allowed the hoard to be lifted and excavated within its container and reveal information about the layering of the coins within it. I've also got a picture of the enormous Cation Iron Age hoard coming up in Jersey. This is an incredible bit of engineering, really, to remove this heavy block, which involved, I think, a tractor and a trailer and clever things done with bits of piping. So the ideal situation would be that an archaeologist is able to excavate the context of the hoard and try to get an understanding of the way it went into the ground, any packing, any cuts and fills that might date the sequence of events surrounding the hoards, any other information relating to where it was buried, whether it's in a settlement or out in the open. And so when hoards are excavated like this, they will be lifted as a block usually, and hopefully x-rayed if it's possible. Sometimes we find that hoards are far too dense to be x-rayed, and they're just a solid mass of metal, and we don't get much resolution from them. But increasingly that's possible with better equipment. So block lifting like this preserves the contents of any vessels or organic containers in the position in which they were deposited. Conservators at the British Museum respond quickly to these finds. They x-ray them and assess the best method of their excavation, which is an expensive process in terms of time and resources, but many hoards are recovered in a damp state and will deteriorate after recovery if not kept in the correct environment and removed from their container in a controlled manner. Our conservators do clean coins for the treasure process if needed, but to identification level only if going further would involve more work. Sometimes they just are shiny and lovely when they come out of the pots and they don't need cleaning. So they take care not to enhance the value of the hoard prior to the valuation process, but they will clean them to the extent that this is possible, that it's possible for them to be studied and the rewards given to the people if it is acquired. So when excavating hoards, our conservation team always look out for organic material that's associated with the coins and in the containers. They've found things like linen wrapped around stacks of individual coins, still soft and flexible as if it was buried yesterday. The microbes in the burial environment mean that, the metal ions in the burial environment are toxic to microbes, which means this prevents the process of decay that you'd normally have in organic material. And sometimes minerals leach out into organic material and replace it. We've also had things like grain, for example, this chaff packed around the miniature vessels containing denarii in the Selby hoards. And sometimes we have little rolls of coins that seem to be bound together with textile. We never really know what we're going to find until we excavate a hoard, and it's really an important source of information that might be lost if all the coins were then just chucked into a carrier bag and handed to us, which sadly does happen sometimes too. So it's a process of education, but also requires resource. So as I said, there's a long history of coin hoards being found in these islands, hoards being found in antiquity, but since the 20th century, we have this huge increase in the number of things coming to light. The Treasure Act was brought in to mitigate against the loss of heritage to metal detecting, though sadly some illicit finds are still unreported and something the police are taking increasingly seriously. So quite a lot of my work is now taken up with these sort of cases. Just to illustrate this enormous increase in cases, the purple in this slightly out-of-date slide shows the advent and increase in metal detecting. So finds are still discovered by other methods, of course, chiefly during agricultural and building work and by professional archaeologists who also are required to declare any treasure to the coroner in the normal way. Approximately 100 Iron-aged Roman coin hoards are now being reported each year, although some of these may be new batches from existing hoards. We call these addenda. Roughly the same amount of later hoards, early medieval and post-medieval hoards are reported. So this is just Roman and Iron Age hoards in this graph. The advantage of the long history of recording coin hoards at the British Museum and also of having the Portable Antiquities Scheme, which has run alongside since the 1990s, is that we have a pretty good idea of the pattern of hoarding and distribution of coin finds for England and Wales. I'm not talking about Scotland because that's a completely separate scheme and they have their own data and people who are more qualified to talk about that than I am. But these maps show all Roman coin hoards as dots. These are single finds and as heat maps. And you can see the broad bands of Roman coin use that relates, among other things, to topography, which influences both ancient and modern land use. Also to do with modern detecting restrictions, which explains the gap in the New Forest. And some urban areas are less productive because they're built over. But generally, this pattern is reflective of the pattern of greatest density in the Roman occupation of Britain and therefore the greatest amount of coin use. General pattern of coin hoards is shown on this map, and with dots for hoards, it broadly reflects the same area of general coin use, which is more or less across the southwest to southeast from the Severn to the Wash, and in some military areas. You can see Hadrian's Wall picked out in dots here. But there are some differences, I think, with more hoards perhaps in more peripheral locations, such as coastal and upland areas, compared to the background coin find density. So I'm not going to show you a whole load of graphs, you'll be pleased to know, but just to say we have a good understanding now then of the general pattern for hoarding in Britain and can compare hoards to the background pattern of single finds for the Roman period. Here I've just, by various periods during the Roman occupation of Britain, compared the background pattern of finds in blue to the numbers of Roman coin hoards, which is quite a crude method of comparison, but it just shows that we have relatively low levels of discovery of hoards and finds in the 1st century AD, which increases through the Antonine periods and reduces with the general reduction in supply in the early 3rd century, peaking dramatically in the later 3rd century, alongside the debasement of the coinage due to inflation. We have much higher levels of background coin use, if you like, or background coin loss in the 4th century. You can debate this a lot, but it's interesting here that the hoards don't quite reflect that peak there. And then we have a well-known peak of hoards in the very end of the 4th to 5th century, 4th to 5th century at the end of Roman Britain, which is something quite distinctive to Britain and relates to what we think is perhaps the long use of silver coinage such as siliquai around this time after the regular supply has ceased. Anyway, I'm going to give you a pretty quick sort of overview of the general pattern of hoarding, but I also want to put it into context a little bit in terms of earlier sorts of non-coin hoards, which have been occurring since the Bronze Age. So the earliest hoards show a tradition of placing metalwork in the ground or in water away from burials and apparently without the intention of recovery. And in the late Bronze Age to early Iron Age, there's a particular horizon of metalwork hoards, including hoards of socketed axes. Deposition is still practiced here, and activities that seem to have involved groups rather than individuals. So the Salisbury hoard, which is from the later Iron Age, is an example of reburial, perhaps encountering and discovering and reburying an earlier Bronze Age, late Bronze Age, early Iron Age hoard of socketed axes, along with items made perhaps specifically to be put in the hoard in the later Iron Age, including a series of miniature cauldrons and miniature shields. And this recalls the large-scale feasting events that produced the hoard of full-size cauldrons found at Chislehall in Wiltshire, and presumably had a function connected to the life of the community. So I like to stress that when we're talking about ritual, which is a much maligned term, we are talking in the broader sense about the way practices are performed and understood by the group and reinforce beliefs and values held by the group. It need not involve a supernatural element such as the gods, but can also be related to power or kinship here on earth. So Iron Age hoards could be considered an extension of a much longer, Iron Age coin hoards, sorry, could be considered an extension of a much longer tradition of deposition at special places involving other objects such as torques. As we see here in Snettisham, coins were adopted in Britain from the mid to late 2nd century onwards, 2nd century BC. But at Snettisham in Norfolk, a whole sequence of hoards were deposited in a large enclosed area with these striking deposits of torques in various states of damage and repair, joined eventually by Iron Age gold coins. The Great Torque in the British Museum had a quarter stater, an Iron Age gold coin, lodged in one of its terminals. Further individual coins or groups of coins were deposited in the surrounding area and well into the Roman period. So arguably, these hoarding events are about visible public destruction of wealth and have some sort of communal element to them. Later in the British Iron Age, coin hoards became more frequent, and there is considerable regional and chronological variation in the types and denominations found in hoards from the Iron Age, and that's a whole talk in itself. I'm just giving a very sort of broad brush picture here. Fairly recently, the site of Hallerton in Leicestershire has been hugely influential in the way we now think about Iron Age hoarding. We're increasingly aware of sites of multiple or sequential deposition, i.e. not just one hoard, but several hoards or groups of coins being placed in the ground over quite a long period of time. But all too often, these deposits have been ploughed up and scattered, and so all we get is a field full of coins. But at Hallerton, the hoards were still in situ and represented several phases of deposition, which included early imported Iron Age coinage found with animal bones at the entrance to an enclosure you can see in the plan here in blue. And then a cluster of 14 individual coin hoards of mostly local silver coinage with some Roman denarii up to the conquest period, as well as deposits of spectacular Roman cavalry helmets, shown here still in their block in the lab, filled with coins and pig bones. So in my view, it's possible to see some continuity between these late Iron Age and Roman practices involving coin deposition at sacred sites or important sites up to the 2nd century AD. At Ashwell, this stunning hoard of probably later Roman temple treasure was buried in somewhere that was later excavated and found to be quite an ephemeral structure dating from the Iron Age, which had attracted deposits of Iron Age and Roman coins, including small hoards of coins and objects dating to the 2nd century AD, but including items such as Bronze Age weapons, the deliberately broken head of a Roman figurine, and this pierced Claudian copy alongside non-local Iron Age coins. This structure was originally the focus for Iron Age activities such as feasting, but it was used much later as a place for deposition, which may be connected to some existing understanding of the site or the importance of the site throughout the Roman period. So as we move into the Roman period, there's quite a difference between the established area of Iron Age coin use, which was restricted mainly to the south and east, though it did extend up towards sort of Yorkshire in the east and as far as sort of the Welsh borders in the west. And so there's a difference between this and the location of the earliest hoards of Roman coins. It's now generally accepted that Roman Republican coins are reaching Britain before the Roman conquest, and it has been suggested that they are being used as a source of silver for local Iron Age coins. So these two things were coexisting, but perhaps in slightly different systems. Although hoards of denarii are found with local Iron Age silver in the East Anglian area, such as in the Ereswell hoard shown here, but generally not in other places. Although a recent hoard from Askerswell, shown right, consisted of 628 Roman silver denarii to AD 85, no Iron Age coinage. So this is the contrast between things happening in the East Anglian area and things happening elsewhere in Britain. This hoard had a high proportion of Roman Republican coins, which were still circulating in the mid-1st century in a worn state. So the coinage had a long duration, and the more debased legionary denarii of Mark Antony are quite common, as the later Republican coinage that extends right into hoards of the 2nd and even the 3rd century, when most of the other coins had been removed due to their silver content. Just say the largest denarius hoard is this enormous hoard from Shapwick, 9,238 denarii. That's pretty exceptional. Most of these hoards are smaller. This sort of peaks in the Severn period when silver is rapidly going up to the Antonine Wall and beyond Empire in Scotland, and it probably seems quite connected with military activity. I think I'm going to skip over this, I'm a little bit short of time. But just to say that sestertii, which are the main denomination in the 1st and 2nd century AD, are appearing overwhelmingly in hoards that end in the 3rd century. And it's been suggested that these sestertii are being recycled to make imitations of late 3rd century coinage, which are the so-called barbarous radiates. You can see some here. They're very, very crude looking, but the radiate crown, which is the denominational marker, it indicates it's a 3rd century base metal coin, is present, and there's usually a sort of stick man on the reverse. So it's the very minimal design to indicate a coin, but they're not the same weight, they're not the same metal content or manufacture. They seem to be manufactured quite locally. They're made of variable fabric and sometimes made from snipped pieces of metal rather than fully formed blanks. But this tantalising but sadly undated assemblage from Fenny Stratford near Milton Keynes seems to be a forger's toolkit, which had 3 vessels containing separate groups of small pellets, which were perhaps refined or raw material for the production of coinages, chunky discs, and finally what seemed to be unusual unstruck blanks, which would have had their design struck onto them with the iron dies that were found with the hoard, but unfortunately the design on these could not be recovered, so we can't date it for certain, but the metallurgy suggests it's probably of a late 3rd century date. So this sort of thing is happening locally and sort of unofficially, and I don't think these coins were made with the intention to deceive. but they're to do with the monetary context of the late 3rd century, which I will briefly cover. So, but by the late 3rd century, this is the period when we have a huge number of hoards in Britain, and they can be very large. The Frome hoard, over 52,500 coins, the Connecticut hoard, which is the largest hoard from Britain, though far from typical, being in fact, I think, 2 hoards that were unfortunately retrieved in less than ideal circumstances and were mixed up prior to being studied. So these hoards are the bulk of my work. They're most common and tend to be large, but the size is in part a reflection of the low value of the contemporary coinage due to inflation, and it's not out of proportion with the high amounts of background coinage in this date. So analysis of the assemblage of hoards of this date shows actually remarkable homogeneity, and it seems these hoards are more a factor of the situation in the late 3rd century, not necessarily the crises of the mid 3rd century. So from AD 260s, Britain was fairly cut off from the Central Empire in Rome due to a series of usurpers in the so-called Gallic Empire in northern Gaul and Germany. And these are the emperors such as Tetricus and Victorinus that we hear very little about from history, but are disproportionately represented in the British coinage. I mean, anyone who deals with British coinage has these on their desk every day, I think. But, after this episode in AD 274, Aurelian reformed the coinage, but these reformed coins appear to have quite little impact in Britain, and we continued to receive very little fresh coinage until the early 4th century, really. We had another period of usurper rule under Croesus and Electus. So a late 3rd century hoard has a fairly typical composition from AD 274 to AD 296, really. This is just a typical hoard dealt with from Cambridgeshire. And you can see the huge numbers of coinages of Tetricus the First, Tetricus the Second, only produced in 3 or 4 years. Victorinus, but also a small proportion of slightly earlier but poor quality coins from the AD 260s Central Empire. So this is fairly typical from Britain. The so-called barbarous radiates are dated to the interim period between the reforms of Aurelian and Diocletian, so between 274 and 296. But clearly they're not operating quite the same way. So hoards may be entirely made up of these barbarous radiates, but there might be other sort of less regular coinage that's still passing off as genuine coinage within these hoards, the large irregular portion I see here. And we need to be cautious about the precise dating of these hoards due to the lack of presence of the later coins sometimes. Bow Street hoard from Bath is one of the most exciting hoards I've worked on. This is also another later 3rd century hoard. It was excavated by professional archaeologists working on a site in advance of redevelopment of the Roman time of Bath. And it's found up against the interior wall of a building and lifted as an enormous block. Southampton University were able to produce this incredible X-ray image that you can see here, with the presence of at least 6, what turned out to be 8 separate parcels of coinage within the block. And we hope that these parcels would still be able to be located when the block was taken down by conservators at the British Museum very gradually over a long period of time. And actually it exceeded our expectations because it was possible to see the outline of the remains of skin or leather bags that were clearly visible surrounding the coins, preserving the shape of the bags. These showed that the hoard had been sorted into 8 different groups, divided largely by denomination and metal content. So this tells the story of debasement of the coinage that I alluded to earlier. It contained silver denarii, the earliest being a worn Mark Antony Legionary Series denarius issued in 32-31 BC. It also contained higher silver content radiates. So these are radiates from the early part of the 3rd century, which were originally worth 2 denarii, very shiny and chunky. But then it also contained these debased radiates. So what happened in the intervening period between Tetricus and Gordian III, well, gradually the silver content of the coins reduced and they became ostensibly base metal, although treatment of the coinage meant that sometimes there's a preferentially silver looking layer on the outside of the coinage to make them look more silvery, but they were really not. So the Bow Street hoard is important because all these things were going into the same hoard, but it suggests that the hoard was built up over a period of time and then sorted. So the assemblage as whole was buried before during the AD 270s, but could have been assembled over a period of several decades, as by the AD 270s, these denarii were largely out of circulation. I just to say, the late 3rd century hoards of Clausius Electus do occur. Sometimes they're preferentially hoarded, such as Elveden. Sometimes they're rejected, such as in the Gloucester hoard, which is made up of the less common, beautiful, large reformed silver radiates produced between 275 and 296. So I think the takeaway here is that no two hoards are the same, really, although they may seem to be superficially. So as we move into the early 4th century, our main impression is of a lack of coinage and contemporary hoards, but this needs to be treated with caution. One factor affecting the pattern of hoarding at this time is that the successive reforms of the coinage in a short period of time under the Tetrarchy, from heavy nummi like the one shown here to lighter, smaller nummi, meant that it was in the interest of the state to remove coinage from circulation. It's all these very large, expensive metal coins floating around. It probably really wasn't very sustainable. They probably weren't that portable, and they're gradually and quite quickly replaced by the smaller coins that we are more familiar with when we talk about 4th century coins. We tend to call them nummi. We don't really know what they were called. Perhaps a bit technical, but one question is the extent to which the radiates from the 3rd century continued in circulation in the early 4th century. There seems to have been a brief period when these old coins were still available to hoarders, and that's shown by these connected 2 hoards from Surrey in South Wales that are broadly contemporary but have very different contents. So people are always thinking about what they're putting in the pot, they're sorting, they're adding to, taking away from, and that's why hoards always surprise us, including this earlier 19th century hoard from Surrey, which contained earlier coinage and gold rings, and it's tempting to see this as connected to the later hoards in some way, perhaps a descendant of the original hoarder. I don't know. So just an example of hoards from the 4th century, which once the module of the size of the coin is sort of stabilized, it continues to be reformed backwards and forwards, gets larger and smaller again. But the impact of this is less easy to see in the coin hoard records, and coins of similar module are generally hoarded together. Here in the Shrewsbury hoards, we can see a hoard that's being made up over a period of time, again, because it was excavated in layers at the lab, with just the most recent coins coming into the top of the pot, here shown in purple. And if this had been, as I say, tipped into a bag, we would have lost this information. So in the 4th century, coin use remains high on archaeological sites until, well, certainly the AD 370s. But throughout the later 4th century, we see reuse happening in base metal hoards, which again suggests restricted supply, perhaps in the end of the 4th century. Also easy access to earlier coinage, which is still floating around. I'm sure people farming in the Roman period were still finding earlier coins in the ground, just as people find coins in the ground today. And it also suggests perhaps a lack of official control over the coinage. This coin from the Winterslow hoard has been cut down from an earlier hoard, an earlier coin from the 350s, and is probably being used in the 380s, 390s. Or even the early 5th century. So these hoards, these very last bronze hoards from Britain, tends to contain a lot of poorer quality coinage, some with higher lead content, and they mop up many smaller module coins from earlier periods, including 3rd century radiates and smaller 4th century coins, and just sort of mishmash of bronze coins that people were clearly using for day-to-day transactions. But at the same time, we start seeing an early transition to bullion economy from the middle of the 4th century, which means that the monetary economy is breaking down or being complemented by the trade of value of metal by weight, a pound of silver, half a pound of silver, rather than a certain number of coins according to their face value. And Britain is especially rich in late Roman silver hoards of these coins of the denomination known as the siliquae plural, and occasionally the larger denomination, the millierensis or gold solidi. The majority of these hoards are dated to the latest issues of silver coinage that are commonly found in Britain, which are siliquae of Arcadius and Honorius, minted in the Mint of Milan at the very end of the 4th to early 5th century. These are the last coins reaching Britain in any number, but they're usually very clipped. People remove the metal from the edge of the coin gradually over a period of time, which suggests that they circulated well into the 5th century once the official supply of coinage ceased after Britain had exited from the Roman Empire, or rather the Roman Empire had given up on us. This is, of course, the period of the famous Hoxton hoard of coins, and these incredible artifacts and coins are testaments to the extraordinary levels of wealth in the hands of the few at this time. Roman coins, of course, had an afterlife, and they pierced in necklaces in early medieval cemeteries and were traded across the North Sea and beyond as bullion. So as I said, there isn't really time to cover later periods in this talk, and perhaps someone else with expertise in those periods will do this in the future. I hope they will, because they're really fascinating. But just to sort of complete the picture too, though, and take us up to date, I've got a few examples of the more common types of hoards from later periods that we deal with through the treasure process. There's a bit of a hiatus after the end of the Roman monetary economy until the later mid 7th century. We have gold coinage coming in briefly, but most early medieval hoards we deal with the silver. Viking period hoards are particularly striking. They're mixed with bullion and the wide mixture of coinage from Anglo-Saxon and Viking kingdoms all the way to dirhams from the Islamic world. The majority of later treasure cases are smaller silver hoards, often purse losses from the medieval periods. My colleague Barry Cook has just done a corpus bringing all these together, and he does a lot of historical work on the value they might have meant at the time and possible owners of the hoard. And the English Civil War is another period that has furnished above average number of hoards, and it's obviously more clearly linked to conflict and uncertainty of that period. So to end with, finally, I'd just like to talk about a few considerations to do with hoards in museums and perhaps open this up for discussion. It might be nice to share ideas. Most museums have hoards, but how do we display them and make them come alive? What works and what doesn't? Something we do when hoards are being acquired as part of the Treasure Act, we often work with museums to try and support them in this, and we're quite happy to do that and discuss them with other curators. I think, to my mind, the most successful displays take into account the broader context of a hoard. When you really dig into all the aspects of a hoard, you can get quite a lot of information, whether that be to do with the archaeological context of where they're buried. Even if it's a plough find, there might be information in the landscape. It might be possible to look at the historical environment record of the broader area and find an idea of what was going on in the period that the hoard was buried. There's often really exciting stories of discovery. We have a great archive here at the British Museum of paperwork from earlier finds, particularly in the early 20th century, including lovely drawings such as this, which show how the hoard was buried before it was unfortunately hiked out of the ground in an unrecorded location. But we have nice drawings of how it might have been buried by this rock plug. So the how, why, where, people always want to know how, what's it worth, who buried it, why did they bury it, why it was not recovered. And of course, many times we don't know, although we can suggest connections with particular economic events at the time and historical events at the time. But I think the speculation is fun for people, and people like considering these questions. And I think finally that the contents in the containers also are really nice counterpart to a coin hoard. Just bring the coin hoards alive a little bit more, like this hoard that was buried in a flint in the Iron Age. There's a nice story of being discovered by a man who was on his tea break while gravel digging and poured his tea into the flint and shook out the coins. The fact that we still have that sort of what's described as a pebble in our database in another part of the British Museum. We're able to bring this together with the coins to display it. I think added something to the coins, gave it a story of discovery, but also a story of concealment in the Iron Age when the coins were originally put in as flints. Actually, there's quite a few Iron Age coin hoards found in flints. It's a strange thing. It's quite a good hiding place or container. And of course, these things need to be balanced as curators with display considerations. Displays need to be accessible. It's quite challenging to put a large number of small things in an object. A lot of museums deal with innovative ways of dealing with this to allow people to see the coins more clearly. It's a nice display at the Roman Baths in Bath, which uses magnifiers. People can get up close with some of the very many hoards. The Bow Street hoard, they haven't put the whole hoard on display, but they've taken a selection and tried to give an idea of the various proportions of the bags and pick out particular kinds of interest. There's a nice display of the Lemberg hoard at the Buckinghamshire Museum, which has a double-sided panel of glass, so people can see both sides of the coin. But often we have to choose between one face or the other face. Documentation issues are a huge problem with coin hoards, because obviously if you put all your coins in a case, then it's very hard to match them up with registration numbers. So I know some museums might just give a hoard a single number, which solves that problem, but other museums would require every coin to be registered, and sometimes it's a question of then not being able to display the whole hoard. So you might have a false top for a vessel is one solution. Or sometimes we put little bits of paper underneath coins with the numbers on. That can be quite fiddly, though. We found that sticking stickers on the back of coins, which happened in the past, it wasn't ideal because they did leave a residue which needed to be removed by conservators. Obviously, there's security considerations, hoards being of high value, and environmental factors as well. Metal objects not necessarily needing the same environmental conditions as organic materials, for example, that might be associated. So I'm happy to hear thoughts on this, or I hope I've managed to give you a bit of a flavour of the sort of hoards we see at the British Museum. That wasn't too much of a hasty gallop through this. I'm happy to answer any further questions you might have about my work. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Eleanor. That was really fantastic. Again, if anybody has any questions, please post them in the chat. Again, if for whatever reason chat isn't working for you, please email the email address that I put in the chat. So that's mmn@warwick.ac.uk, and I will keep an eye on that inbox whilst we do the question time. So we have a first question from Thomas. Has anyone made a reference list of all the Roman coin hoards in Britain?
They have, yes. I mean, Anne Robertson did a reference list, which is her whole life's work, and was eventually published around 2000. Because of the huge numbers of hoards coming to light since then, we've tried to update that with a recent project we did with the University of Leicester, going through all our records of hoards and archives that we have digitally and on paper, and matching them up with Robertson, but also entering records for new ones. And they're all on the PAS database now with the prefix IARCH. That itself is perhaps not up to date, but all new treasure cases we deal with are now recorded on the Portable Antiquities Scheme database, and hopefully in the future, so that's undergoing some changes at the moment, in the future that might be more accessible and searchable than it is currently. We also, I should say, we also do a roundup every year, which used to be in the Numismatic Chronicle, is now in the British Numismatic Journal, of everything that's found in England, Wales and Scotland.
Whilst we wait to see if there are any more questions, I have a few of my own to fill the space. When you showed us the hoard definitions before, I was wondering, like, because, you know, sometimes like a plough will distribute a hoard across a field. Maybe it was just a purse that was lost, but the coins have been dispersed. In that like circumstance, how do you define if it's a hoard or not? So if someone was like metal detecting a field, for instance, and found coins across the field, but not specifically together, is that still defined as a hoard?
It's a good question, and it's something we sort of grapple with on a daily basis. And I should say, first of all, that it's the coroner that has the eventual say over something, whether something's a hoard or not, and we just have to advise from the point of our numismatic knowledge. There are many factors to consider. I mean, a hoard generally tends to have a more discrete start and end point and clear sort of pattern of contents. So, for example, if I have a 4th century hoard, I wouldn't expect it to be full of zenari. I mean, normally, of course, the Treasure Act's including things that aren't necessarily straightforward hoards, like temple deposits. You might think, oh, hang on a minute, we've got a temple here, so I might expect a wider spread of coinage. That wouldn't be a hoard, but it would still be a treasure case. But sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but it's looking at things like the aspect of the land, if it's a steep slope, if there's differences in conditions of the coins, if there's different circumstances about the occasions in which they're found. But often hoards do get ploughed up year after year. This particularly happens with the Iron Age. So we might have batches of the same hoard coming to light over several years. So it's just a bit of a judgment call according to the particular hoard and may need to do with the patterning of the contents within it.
Cool. Thank you very much for answering the question. Another one I have is sort of like, typically how long does it take for you to go through a hoard and identify a hoard? Because presumably it goes to the conservators first, right, and is cleaned, and then it's handed to you.
Usually, I mean, we try not to clean unless we need to. So sometimes I work with coins that are quite dirty and they will take longer, but that's a balance between the resources that is required for conservation. I mean, it's how long is a piece of string. Some periods are easier to deal with than others. I think we all have our favourite coin periods, but some will be quite quick and some do require a bit of agonising in comparison with published sources. We have a bit of a backlog at the moment as well. So yeah, quite a long time sometimes.
Yeah, because I was thinking when you were telling us about how many hoards were found, like across the decades, and then how many are being found every year now. It's quite a lot.
It's a challenge. I would say that the finds liaison officers have a much bigger role now, and often, in fact, normally it's them who prepare the reports rather than myself and Wendy Scott, my equivalent in the later periods, but we still have oversight over those reports and check them as well, which in itself takes time. So we have sight of everything that comes through, but not actually physically sight of everything that comes through, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, amazing work, really. It's crazy.
I enjoy it.
I've got a question from Johan. He said, "Thanks, Eleanor. Do you have any advice for finding funders/no organizations to help local authority museums purchase coin hoards when they are found? In our country, this is very regularly." So I'm presuming this is an out of UK question. So it might be a bit different.
Yes, I mean, I can only really advise on the sort of British funding bodies. I mean, in increasingly it's a tough funding environment, I'm not going to lie, and I know that museums are increasingly under more pressure than they ever have been, so it's always a challenge. But there are established routes such as the Arts Council England, V&A, Purchase Grant Fund and Heritage Memorial Fund, but it probably would be better to talk to the curator and the Treasury unit about the specific case, because they might have other ideas. There's some smaller charities that also fund coin hoards. And often people crowdfund. I don't know whether that's always successful, but that's happened quite a bit recently with some success. But yeah, I think sometimes it's a bit of a tough sell, and it's a shame. It's a problem we have nationally, given the volume of stuff coming up. And I think we also have to think about what an important hoard to retain is, and sadly might have to not keep everything.
Thank you for answering the question. I will ask another one. I'll just check the inbox quickly. So you showed us some fantastic examples of how to display coin hoards, and I guess this links into funding, because I guess it's difficult to fund the purchase of a coin hoard when coins are notoriously difficult to display. What do you think the best sort of case scenario for displaying a coin hoard is, for like maximum engagement with the public?
I'm not sure there's any one sort of recipe for success. I think, as I said, anything that puts the hoard in context and lets people understand why this enormous lump of money is sitting in this particular county is good. But there's huge creativity across museums, and I'm always surprised by what people manage to do with hoards. And it's just nice to go and look at other displays and see what other people have done with them. It's a nice thing to be able to talk about as a forum, and perhaps something that Money and Medals can help a bit with.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, definitely something to think about as well. I can't see any more questions in the chat, and I haven't received any emails with any further questions. So I guess with that, I will thank you again, Eleanor. I'm sure everyone in the chat, I don't know if they can clap in the chat or something, but they were all saying thank you before. So thank you very much. Our next talk will be on the 16th of April with Carl Savage, who will be presenting on Scottish coins of Robert III to James VI, so from 1390 to 1603. I will send an email out via the MMN with the information on how to register for that shortly. We will also have last month's video with Andrew Brown that will be posted on YouTube later this month. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and thank you again, Eleanor. There's lots of people in the chat saying thank you as well. And with that, I will end the call.